Tonight is no ordinary night. It is a threshold where we step from the light of day into the shadow of the unknown. Before you close your eyes, before the terrors of the night can whisper, before the vulnerabilities of the dark can take root, take this moment and remember the Father has been your shield. And now, as the shadows lengthen and the world grows dim, I raise to you my evening prayer, a prayer for protection. The protection that this world, so fragile and haunted by unseen forces, so desperately needs. The shelter that vulnerable and trembling souls search for. From the very first moment, my feet touched the floor. You were my fortress. You were the shield that went before me when the arrows of uncertainty flew, and the refuge that hid me when the day grew hostile. Amidst the chaos and the battles of the day, when the enemy sought to steal my joy and plant seeds of fear, you were the fortress that could not be breached. When my steps faltered on slippery paths, and the deceiver laid snares for my soul, you were the hedge of thorns that kept me safe. Thank you, my Father, for never leaving me exposed to the ravages of this world, but for being my unseen guardian, the watchman who never blinks before danger can strike. I ask by the blood you shed for us, that you build a hedge of fire around my home, my family, and those I love. I also ask that you cast your shield over this broken world, for every soul trembling in the shadows of violence, for every child crying in the dark, and for every father who keeps watch in fear of the enemy. I cry out to you, O Lord, arise and be our defense. Make this night of ours a fortress of divine safety, for binding the forces of darkness and for unlocking a new dawn secured by the chains of your covenant. The protection I pray for is not merely an absence of harm or a hiding from trouble, but that holy encompassing that surrounds the vulnerable. That profound certainty that wraps the soul when it knows without a doubt that you are the Lord of hosts, and that you are the watchman who never slumbers. As the night deepens and the world becomes a stage for shadows, nothing remains but the sound of my breathing anchored in your promises. In this sacred stillness, I offer my night prayer. The night is a time of exposure, a time when the armor of the day falls away, a time to admit how deeply we need your covering. O my Father, sleep is a leap into the unknown, a complete surrender of my defenses to your keeping. And now, as I pull the covers and lay my head on my pillow, I surrender my vulnerability to you. I entrust to you my resting spirit, my defenseless body, and my unseen tomorrow. I place in your hands all the fears of the night that I am unable to fight, and all the terrors that stalk the edges of my mind. Consume them, Lord, for they have no power in your presence. I ask in this night prayer that you protect me from every snare of the enemy and every haunting memory. Guard my going out and my coming in, and keep my loved ones safe beneath the shadow of your wings. Remember, O Lord, everyone spending this night in danger, the victims of abuse, the refugees fleeing under the cover of dark, and the lonely souls haunted by despair. Place your mighty hand upon them, and grant them a fortress of safety and deliverance. Make this night, O my Lord, a garment of armor that clothes me, so that in its darkness I may feel the weight of your presence. Teach me that the shadows cannot hide from you, and that the deepest midnight and the brightest noon are the same to you. both bathed in your sovereign light. Purify my heart from any daytime compromise, and wash me with the water of your grace, so that I may wake up tomorrow like a warrior ready to stand in the gap. Thank you, my Father, for being my shield today. And just as you stood between me and the battles of the day, I pray that you stand guard over the quiet hours of the night. Cover me with your feathers as I close my eyes. Be the last defense I cling to before sleep overtakes me, and the first strong tower I run to with the rising of the new dawn. In your holy name, in the name of your unbreakable shield, in the name of your protection that surpasses all danger, I pray and give thanks. Amen. Drop an amen in the comments below. Let your amen be a declaration that you are standing under the shadow of the Almighty and that you trust Him with your tomorrow. If you have a specific burden or a loved one who desperately needs God's protection tonight, write their name in the comments. Let this community of faith stand in the gap and agree with you in prayer.